You ever just play Sonic the Hedgehog and think to yourself, man, I wish this game was worse? If you answer yes to that, then I have the perfect game for you. Somari. Sometimes video game developers just take a step back, for one reason or another, they'll go back and they'll remake a game for older hardware. Sometimes it's pretty much the same game, sometimes it's the same game but 10 times worse. And every once in a while, you'll get a little gem of a game that might stray away a little bit from the original, but it just strays away just enough to be good, or sometimes better than the original. For example, Dark Void. Does anybody remember Dark Void? I sure don't. But does anybody remember Dark Void Zero? I think like 2 people at least. This is a fairly obscure 3DS game and a perfect example of a demake done right. Even though it isn't completely a demake, as a kid though, I actually thought this was an old NES game. And I didn't find out until years later that it actually was just a demake of some Xbox game nobody cared about. But today, we're not talking about good demakes. We're talking about the bad ones. The bad illegal ones. Stuff like Somari. In case you couldn't tell or didn't know, Somari is a bootleg demake of Sonic the Hedgehog. Also, Sonic is now Mario for some reason. So this came out around 1994, but some later versions actually just use Sonic the Hedgehog instead of this weird Sonic Mario hybrid, who I assume is the one called Somari. Now, Somari is one of the most famous bootleg games of all time, probably the most famous bootleg demake of all time, but it's not very good. But it is still pretty wild to actually see Sonic the Hedgehog, well, sort of Sonic the Hedgehog, running on the NES. Somari and later the Famicom version of Sonic were developed by Hummer Team, probably the most famous bootleg game company. Hummer Team pumped out tons of these demakes back in the 90s because over in China, video game consoles were in high demand, but companies had to pay crazy high tariffs to ship their consoles into China, which then meant higher prices, so the consoles ended up being too expensive and there just weren't enough to go around for everybody. Because of this and China's copyright laws being practically non-existent, bootleg consoles and games ran rampant through China in the 90s and 2000s. Since most people in China who played video games usually just owned a Famicom console, which is a bootleg Famicom usually made in China, the Chinese game companies would just take newer games that were popular in other countries and just rebuild them from the ground up to play on the Famicom cartridges. And this is exactly how we ended up with stuff like Somari, or another one of my favorites, Super Mario World on the NES. It's another Hummer Team classic here. It's almost Super Mario World on the NES. I say almost because it is horrendous. The game honestly looks and sounds decent, even though most of the songs are really off and somebody clearly didn't understand how color palettes work on the NES, but it's still recognizably Super Mario World. The main problem is with the gameplay. The physics of this game are just so bad. At times it's nearly unplayable due to Mario just randomly speeding up and slowing down at times, and the fact that the camera is kind of wonky too, so platforming can just be a pain. And since this game is a platformer, that's a major issue. You pick up a ton of speed running up slopes and lose all of your momentum the second you start going downhill, which just makes no sense. And also jumps are super slow and floaty. Even though it's not good, like at all, it genuinely is still a pretty impressive game when you really think about it. Nintendo themselves literally said Super Mario World could have never worked on the NES, and Hummer Team literally looked at Super Mario World and rebuilt it from the ground up on the exact console Nintendo said it would never work on. And they even did get most of the features of the game, like the large connected overworld map, the spin jump, the box that stores the extra item from when you get hurt, and even Yoshi somehow. There's also now apparently a fan remake of the bootleg demake, and apparently it fixes pretty much all of the problems I mentioned, like the messed up colors, off-key music, and the janky physics. But since Nintendo hates their fans and wipes stuff like fan games off the internet, I was only able to get one download for the ROM of this remake, and I unfortunately was not able to get the ROM to play for some reason, so I can't really confirm whether it's better or not. One of Hummer's other most famous games was Kart Fighter, the infamous Mario fighting game that actually came before Smash Bros. This one isn't really a demake though, it's just a regular bootleg since it's a totally original game, just using copyrighted Nintendo characters. However, Kart Fighter uses the same exact engine as another game that is, in fact, a demake, Street Fighter II The World Warrior, also on the Famicom/NES. And as far as I can tell, this was Hummer's first bootleg game, although they did have one unlicensed Famicom game before this called Jinkei Jinzhuang, I think I pronounced that right, which is, oddly enough, an RPG about Jinkei, the guy who tried to kill Qin Shi Huang. You know, the dude from Civilization 6. Back to the Street Fighter bootleg though, once again it's almost Street Fighter 2. There's only 4 characters to play as here. Apparently you fight Vega and M. Bison at the end of the game, but I didn't play for long enough to fight them. It's pretty awkward to control and pretty tough just because it's not made very well, but just like the other games, it's impressive just to see this game being played on the NES at all, even if Guile looks like he got his face smashed in before the fight. Now, even though I wasn't exactly a fan of Hummer's Street Fighter, they must have been pretty proud of it, because they made a ton of these things. Now, I already mentioned Kart Fighter, but they also had Master Fighter 2 to be exact. There was no Master Fighter 1. Master Fighter 2 is actually just Street Fighter 2, like the one I just talked about, under a different name to avoid copyright issues. However, there was also Master Fighter 6. Once again, they missed a few numbers, but this one has a ton of characters. They have all of the original Street Fighter 2 characters this time, then a lot of characters that are just clones of each other, but it's still cool that it's much closer to the original Street Fighter 2. Next, they had Street Fighter 4. You might be thinking right now, oh, is that a demake of the real Street Fighter 4? And if you thought that, you'd be wrong. The real Street Fighter 4 came out in 2008. This game came out in 1993. Street Fighter 3 didn't even exist yet. So does this mean that Capcom's Street Fighter 4 is a remake? Or is this a demake before the original even came out? They also did an adult fighting game on the Famicom, but I can't show that on YouTube. It also just wasn't a demake, so it isn't really relevant here. They also had Garu Densetsu Special, a demake of Fatal Fury Special. I've never played Fatal Fury Special, but the demake is just another Street Fighter clone. Apparently it was re-released as Mortal Kombat 6, and all they bothered to change was the title screen. Hummer Team also released their own version of Mortal Kombat, besides the previously mentioned Mortal Kombat 6. This is Hummer's Mortal Kombat 2, which was later released under every name possible, including Mortal Kombat 2 Special, Mortal Kombat 2 Turbo, Mortal Kombat 3, Mortal Kombat 3 Turbo, and Mortal Kombat 18. Oh, and also, Mortal Kombat 3, Mortal Kombat, Special, 56 peepholes. Just imagine being a kid in the 90s and your friend says, oh, I got the new Mortal Kombat on the Nintendo, and you're like, oh, rad, dude. Mortal Kombat 4? Nah, dude. Mortal Kombat 3 Special, 56 peepholes. Now, it's just pretty similar to their other fighting games, but once again, it's pretty cool to see something that resembles Mortal Kombat running on the NES. They also did Yu Yu Hakusho Final. Apparently this is a demake of a game based on an anime series, but I'm not really an anime guy, so I don't know much about this one. Another one they did was Shin Samurai Spirits 2, which is a demake of Samurai Showdown 2, a game I've never actually heard of until just now. And they made a port of a Dragon Ball Z game from the Super Nintendo, but once again, I'm not an anime guy, I really don't know anything about Dragon Balls. Also, Tekken 2 on the Famicom. I only ever played Tekken once at some random arcade with my friend, and I got destroyed every single time. I haven't touched it since then, but this game has the guy from Smash Bros. The last of Hummer's Street Fighter demake clones seem to have been Street Fighter 0297, a demake of Street Fighter 02, and the King of Fighters 96, which came out in 1998. Both of these games are pretty much the same idea as all the others, the original Hummer Street Fighter with characters from the real versions of these games. And keep in mind, all of these were released like several times each, under all kinds of different wacky names. So if you've played something like, I don't know, like Street Fighter 3027, it was probably one of these. Besides fighting games, Hummer Team also made Famicom demakes of several other games, including the Super Nintendo Aladdin game, the Super Nintendo Power Rangers game, the Tiny Toon Adventures Game Boy game, which I don't really know if that's a remake or a demake, Earthworm Jim from the Genesis, which somehow actually works, sort of, and Donkey Kong Country, which somehow exists and surprisingly isn't even that bad. And it seems like their last game they released was appropriately Final Fight 3, although they would continue to re-release their older games, as I mentioned, under different names and things, bundled together on multi-carts for years. All of these ports are pretty much the same idea. Take the original game, simplify it to work on the Famicom, slap a random number or word like Special or Turbo on it, and ship it. And as bad as they all are though, once again, it really is actually cool just to see them running on NES hardware. I mean, they really are just novelties though, and once that initial thought of, wow, cool, Earthworm Jim on the NES wears off, then you're just sitting there wondering what went wrong in your life that led you to the point of playing Earthworm Jim on the NES. But wait, I'm not done yet, there's more of these games, because Hummer Team wasn't the only company to make these Famicom demakes. Now there are some fan demakes too, but I'm gonna try to just stick to the bootleg ones for today. So here's Final Fantasy VII on the NES. They tried. Oddly enough, this one actually came out in 2005. It is more of a ROM hack than a totally new game, like most of Hummer's were, but it honestly works a lot better a lot of the time because it's basically an NES Final Fantasy game that just follows most of the story of Final Fantasy VII. And now we're moving on to the Zelda series with The Legend of Zelda Triforce of the Gods on the Famicom. Triforce of the Gods was the Japanese name for A Link to the Past, and this is sort of A Link to the Past. Similar to Super Mario World, it looks pretty similar to the real thing, but it just doesn't feel right and it's missing a ton of content. Okay, now I only have one more demake I want to show you. I was gonna do other consoles too, but I ran out of time, so next week I'll be looking at the possibly even more interesting Game Boy demakes. But for now, we'll get to this last one today. Alright, get ready for this. This is wild. It's Windows 98. Fucking Windows 98? What the? This has to be the most bizarre bootleg I've ever seen. Once again, it came from good old China, and it's in almost all Chinese, so I have no clue what it's saying, but this entire thing is just absurd. It has all these fake programs where you click it thinking you're opening Microsoft Paint or something, but it's just a static image. I just don't understand what the purpose of this thing was. It's just so strange and I cannot comprehend the reasons behind its existence. They even have a fake Internet Explorer and fake fax machine. And this camel. Oh, and Pikachu is here for some reason. They didn't even spell Microsoft right on the fake website. Nothing here works. The calculator doesn't work. Microsoft Word doesn't work. Even the volume slider doesn't work. You're just doomed to be pressing random fake icons with Chinese words on them forever until you get a fake virus.